Bonjour, je suis Drew Hanish de la Whisky Lore, and I am not going to do this entire video in French. Don't worry, you don't need a translator. I am doing French whiskey though today and checking out Armorik, which is a brand made by Varennes, which is a distillery in Brittany, France. And if you don't know anything about geography, but you've heard of France before, the area of Brittany is up in the northwest corner, right on the ocean, right on the Atlantic, and it is actually one of the six Celtic nations, one of the original six Celtic nations. So when you think Scotch, Irish, well, this fits right in terms of legend and lore and bits of culture. And so what better location to have a single malt whiskey than the area called Brittany? And so if you check out my interview with Christine Cooney of Heavenly Spirits, they distribute Armorik as well as Bastille, and she will give you some background on the history of French whiskey, which is not a long history, but it's a history that, there were questions that I had going into it, such as, why is it that France has been distilling brandy, cognac, Armagnac for so long, but that for some reason they've avoided whiskey, especially when they are tied with Germany for the second biggest grower of barley. It just seems like a no-brainer that they would be in the whiskey world. So she kind of answers that question in the interview. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce you to two different expressions from Armorik. And the first expression is their classic, which the label you see here with the white label, even though it's a mini, that's very close to what their current bottle branding looks like. This is actually an older label, and the bottle design has changed a bit, but you can see what the name looks like there. And I recently did a tasting of their heavily peated, which I was highly impressed with. And it's amazing how the sea character is there in that whiskey, and the smoke, and what they do with that whiskey is, I'm not sure if they peat it in, she wasn't clear on this as to whether they peat it in Belgium or in Scotland, but it is peated elsewhere because they can't dig up peat in France because of the law. Well, this is unpeated. Both of these are unpeated, but we're going to find out how being on that northwest corner of France on a rocky coast is going to influence the whiskey. There are two different ones here. As I said, classic is a lighter whiskey. Both are 46% ABV, but the lightness in this whiskey comes from its aging. It is aged around 6 years, according to Christine, in a combination of American oak barrels, so ex-bourbon barrels, as well as refill sherry barrels. So just a very light influence of that sherry to bring out some of the character. And it's interesting tasting, because she gave me quite a few different bottles, including their sherry cask version, the peated version, their Armagnac version. And there is a consistency between almost the entire line with one particular note, which I'm going to give you as we do the nosing and tasting here. Now, this is a distillery with a long history, 120 years, but they've only been making whiskey since 1987. And again, we'll go into the history on the podcast episode, but made with 100% French barley, to have everything that you need to make whiskey in France other than peat if you want to have peat influence on your whiskey. Very nice green apple comes in on this. There's a malty character that comes right through. You get a little hint of a briny character to this, but it is very, very light. And maybe a little citrus. If you're a fan of Highland whiskies, I think that you would try this, nose it, and say, yeah, I could see this if you were doing a blind nosing and tasting. I think you might conclude that this might be a Highland. Cheers. Or Sante. Oh, the fruit comes right out. Orchard fruits. Maybe a little cinnamon in there. Ginger note. That's what comes in on the finish. Like this ginger note just kind of surrounds your mouth. There's a little briny character to this. That's salt. That's sea salt. There's definitely an influence of that there. And then the malt has a hint of lemon to it, just a hint of lemon, fresh. And yeah, it's nice. It's not an extremely long finish, except that ginger note just kind of stays there and lingers. Mouthfeel is kind of a medium mouthfeel. It's not a heavy mouthfeel by any stretch of the imagination. I was really impressed with that when I first tasted it. It's not a whiskey that I would say is going to be overly complex and knock your socks off that way. But it's just a very drinkable whiskey, and it comes with that pepper note, ginger note at the end that is different from a lot of different whiskeys that I have tried. Now, this double maturation actually is aged in two different types of barrels. It is aged in a barrel that's made from wood that comes from a forest, the Armorik forest, I believe is what it's, the regional park. It's kind of a rocky terrain and a forest there. And this is the only distillery that's allowed to use wood from there. And so this is going to be a unique character in the whiskeys that they produce that use this particular type of wood in their barrels. The sherry note, because that's the other barrel that they use a first fill sherry barrel as the other barrel to influence this one. And when I talked to Christine, she said she has to battle, really. She'll talk to people and say, here, would you like to try this French whiskey? And they go, French whiskey? And they'll kind of turn their nose up. And so she started doing blind tastings, and she said, would you like to try this single malt? And then people say, well, what part of Scotland does that come from? And so she has to say, it doesn't come from Scotland, it comes from France. And they are immediately impressed at that point. And, I can see that. I can definitely see that in these whiskeys. So like the other whiskey, it does come with the green apple. It comes with a honey note, but it's also got a heavier nose to it. You get a little bit of that leather tobacco mix that comes in on the nose on this one. It's not aggressively sherry, but it does have, you can tell some hints. Sante. Much more of a milky consistency. The grain comes right through, but it's not a bright grain. There's the lemon note there. There's a little of that orchard fruit. But you're picking up a lot more of the leather and tobacco notes on this whiskey. not heavy. There's also a brininess to this as well. So it's picking up that sea character in the taste of this. It's very interesting. Like I say, it's more muted, whereas the classic is a little more bright. So your flavors here are going to be more of maybe your dried fruits. There is a dry character to this whiskey as well versus the other one. So really a choice between, do you like brighter, pepperier whiskeys, or do you like one that's a little bit more muted in terms of that ginger spice, and instead gives you a little bit more of those warm, dry tobacco and leather notes. Those are very light though. Like I say, it is a delicate balance here in this particular whiskey. So I think both of them are good whiskeys, and I would recommend to people that they seek out French whiskey because, again, the industry is going to grow. It's worth tasting whiskey from around the world and getting exposed to it and getting yourself an opportunity to educate your palate, maybe pick up some distinctive flavors that will be coming from one country's whiskey versus another country's whiskey. And I think both of these whiskeys are easily accessible in terms of their flavor profiles. They're not going to offend anybody, I don't think. And I think for the Scotch whiskey fan, they could transition to these very easily. So it's going to be fun to see where they go with these whiskeys. I actually love the heavily peated one. And so I'm going to keep my eye out to see if I can find a bottle of that to add to my collection as well. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you've tried French whiskey before and you have a different brand that you've tried, mention them below, and also like the video if you've gotten some value out of this, and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos down the road. There's just not enough whiskey in that glass. Until next time, cheers and Sante.